Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. Today I'm casting on another one of my Cereus sweaters, and I'd like to show you how to provisionally cast on the neckline stitches. So when you're ready to finish the neckline at the end of your knitting, all of your stitches will be held neatly on a spare interchangeable needle cord. I like using a provisional cast on for top-down sweaters that have round necklines like this one for a couple reasons. First, when it's time to add the neckline edging or collar, you don't have to pick up any stitches along the edge. All of the stitches are already on a needle cord, so you can just add a needle tip and start stitching. Second, the boundary between the sweater and the neck edging has a lot more stretch because it didn't start as a cast on edge. It's just this continuous series of stitches. To cast on, you're going to need a couple of things. Of course, you'll need your circular needles that you're going to use to start knitting your sweater, but you're also going to need a spare interchangeable needle cord that's longer than the neckline of your sweater. And it's really helpful to work without tips on the cord so that you don't poke yourself. And if you can, cap off the ends of the cord so you don't accidentally drop any held stitches as you're knitting the rest of your sweater. Let's get started. The provisional cast on in the round starts with a slip knot, but instead of placing that slip knot on your knitting needles, it's placed on the tipless cord that will hold the stitches that will be worked later on. Pull on the working yarn to tighten up that slip knot. Just be careful not to tighten things up too much. For now, the slip knot's going to be held on your cord. Eventually, later on, you're going to need to be able to slide it up the cord and onto a knitting needle. So just make sure it's not too tight. I like to tension my working yarn simply by weaving it over, under the fingers on my left hand. And then the knitting needle is held in my right hand. And I'm also going to scoop this yarn tail into my right hand so that I can hold it out of the way and it doesn't get caught in my cast on stitches. So right now, the knitting needle is at the back, the working yarn is in the middle, and our tipless cord is at the front. The slip knot does not count as a cast on stitch. We're only going to count the stitches that are being cast on to our knitting needle, but you will end up with the same number of stitches on your needle as there are held on the cord for later. Things start a little differently depending on whether you need to cast on an odd number of stitches or an even number of stitches. If you're casting on an odd number of stitches, you cast on the first stitch by making a yarn over. So you bring the yarn forward and over your knitting needle. So this counts as the first cast on stitch for now, and the slip knot is held on the cord for later. However, for my sweater, I need to cast on an even number of stitches. So I don't need this yarn over at the beginning. I'll just start with my cast on motion. So I'm going to kind of hold that slip knot with my finger just so that things don't slide away from me as I'm getting started. For the motion, the needle tip comes forward, under the cord, over the working yarn, scoop that yarn forward under the cord. The slip knot kind of flipped over there, which is what I want to happen. That wouldn't happen if I already had the yarn over on the needle. And then I'm going to make a yarn over by bringing the yarn forward and over the needle. And I'm going to hold that in place. So now you can see I have 2 stitches on my needle that I'm counting now, and 2 stitches hanging on the cord that will be used later. I have everything kind of spread out here so you can see what's happening. In real life, when you're casting on, you need those stitches to the needle and the cord rather to be much closer together so that your cast on isn't loose and sloppy. But so that you can see how everything looks, I'm going to leave it a little bit more spread out. I'm going to hold that last yarn over in place and then repeat the motion. The needle tip comes forward, under the cord, back over the working yarn, scoop the working yarn forward under the cord, and then yarn over. And we'll spread things out a bit. And again, you can see I have 4 stitches on the needle that I'm counting for now, and 4 stitches underneath hanging on the cord for later. And the motion one more time. The needle tip comes forward, under the cord, back over the working yarn, scoop the working yarn forward under the cord, and yarn over. 6. So I would continue repeating that motion over and over again until I have enough stitches cast on. And you'll notice here as I'm casting on, it's really helpful so things don't get away from you to always hold that yarn over in place before you continue with the cast on motion. So I've cast on all of my stitches and I'm just about ready to start knitting my first round. And before I do that, I'm going to need to shift my stitches up to the other needle tip so I can actually start knitting. I'm going to be very careful to hold this last stitch that I cast on in place so that it does not escape from me at all, because it's very easy with so many needles and cords happening here for things to shift around. I also want to make sure that my cord that is just holding stuff is not wrapped around the cord of the circular needle that I'm actually going to be knitting on. So to do that, you want it to kind of look like train tracks. And what I mean by that is the one side of the track, the outside of the rail, is going to be my knitting needle all the way around the outside of this curve. The inner rail is the cord that doesn't have any needle, and it comes around the inside of the curve all the way. If it is twisted up around each other, if the 2 cords are twisted around, you need to work that out. So I have my nice train tracks here. I'm going to hold my needle tips together, and then I'm just going to shift my stitches down to the tip of my left needle. And this shifting, it's going to feel awkward no matter what. It feels awkward. And if it's bothering you, just remember, later on, you're not going to have to pick up any stitches around the neckline. So in my mind, that's probably worth a little bit of awkwardness here. The cord without the needle tips is just going to hang here out of your way. You don't need to do anything with it. We're ready now. We're positioned to just start knitting. If my first stitch happened to be a knit, my yarn would already be set up to go because my yarn here, my working yarn, is at the back. So I would be able to just insert my right hand needle knitwise through the first stitch on my left needle and then knit the stitch. Again, that looks like a hot mess. I promise when you're actually doing it, it's not that bad. If your first stitch happens to be a purl, and for my particular pattern it does, my yarn here is not set up correctly to start knitting. So I need to bring it around and between the needle and cord that are in my right hand so that I can actually purl that stitch. So now my yarn is at the front and I'm ready to purl. So I can go ahead and go through that first stitch on my needle purlwise and then purl the stitch. The first stitch needs to be fairly tight so that things don't loosen up in between the last cast on stitch and that first cast on stitch. So just make sure that first stitch in the round is pretty snug. After that, it's just a matter of knitting in the round. And again, you just need to kind of ignore this cord that's hanging there and just work your stitches in whatever pattern you're doing. And I happen to be using a 2x2 ribbing here. So I'm going to knit 2 and then purl 2 all the way around, and make sure that your stitches don't leapfrog over the top of each other as they're coming up your needles. So I'm just going to go ahead and work my knit 2 purl 2 ribbing all the way around. As you're knitting your first round of stitches, just be careful and make sure you're maintaining your train tracks, with the outer rail being the knitting needles and the inner rail of the track being your needleless cord that is just holding stitches, just so that you don't end up with any problems at the end. And I'm here down to my last few stitches. So I'll just finish up my round here so that you can see what's happening at the end. One thing you can do when you do get to the end of the round, you may want to place a stitch marker on your right hand needle just to mark the end or beginning of the round, but I think I'm just going to use my tail here as kind of a guide. So here I am at the last cast on stitch. I'm going to go ahead and purl that. And now I'm back to the first stitch of my round, and I can continue knitting, and I'll worry about these held stitches a little bit later on. I finished knitting the yoke of my sweater, and even though I am not quite ready to actually start knitting on the neckline, I've transferred all of the stitches that were held on that very long tipless cord onto a shorter circular needle, so I can show you what to expect when you get to that point. The quirky thing about the provisional cast on is that those stitches that are held for later have alternating stitch mounts, which means that some of the stitches will have a conventional mount with the right leg of the stitch at the front of the needle, but they alternate with stitches that have a reverse mount, and that right leg of the stitch will be at the back of your knitting needle. The good news is there are a couple of ways you can deal with this when you're actually ready to start knitting. The first option is to remount all of your stitches by slipping them purlwise before you start knitting. Slipping purlwise, no matter how it's mounted, is going to give it a conventional mount. So this first stitch has the reverse mount with that right leg of the stitch at the back of the needle. But if I slip it purlwise by bringing my right needle from the back to the front through the stitch, and then I slip it from left to right, now the right leg of the stitch is at the front of the needle, just like we would conventionally expect to see. So all of the stitches around, I'm just going to go through, insert my right needle purlwise from the back to the front, and then slip from left to right. Insert from back to front, slip left to right, insert from the back to the front, and slip from left to right. And now all of these slipped stitches have a conventional mount. Option 2 is just to work the stitches as they're mounted on the needle. You just have to remember that you're not necessarily going to be working around the front leg of the stitch. But for knits, if you make sure you're inserting your knitting needle knitwise from the front to the back, you'll be fine. And if you want to make a purl, insert your right needle purlwise from the back to the front through this stitch, and again, you'll be fine. I hope you enjoyed learning how to do a provisional cast on in the round for a top-down sweater. And if you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you'd like to try this technique in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechillydog.com and look for my Cereus sweater. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!